Boys and girls, kids of all ages, welcome back to Mr. Herring's fifth grade social studies class. Today we are finishing our unit 2 with slavery in the colonies, triangular trade, and we're going to talk a little bit about the middle passage. So let's go ahead and get started. Today, our Learn It, I can summarize the developments of the triangular trade and describe ways slaves resisted forced labor in the colonies. My essential question is, why did slavery develop in the colonies? Some vocabulary that we need to think about. Slavery, of course, we know that it's the practice of owning and controlling people against their will. The slave trade was the process, was the practice of actually um, buying and selling slaves for profit. And then the triangular trade route is just that. It's a triangle route between Africa, the Americas, North and South, and Europe, which ships carried cash crops, manufactured goods, enslaved people, spices, any raw material or finished products between the three groups of continents. And then finally, uprising, which is a rebellion, which will be heavily talked about in the next unit. Okay, so here is the British Empire in 1937. If you look at this, all that colored is places that Great Britain had colonized, had colonies, had occupation. And I want you to, think about that for a second. I'm going to show you something here. This little bitty country right there, that little bitty country is England, and they control all this other color. Everywhere you see, they have control over. Now that says something. That's a pretty powerful group of people there to live in that little bitty area and have colonized so much of the world actually. Just huge colonies um, all over. That's 1937. Why do they colonize? Well, for money. It's mostly about money. Great Britain was well established with their religious beliefs, so it wasn't about God or anything like that. They were after money. For trade, they wanted to trade to make more money. For power, because the more land you own, the more powerful you are. For protection, because if you think about it, they could, if someone wanted to invade them, they have colonies all over to attack their enemies. For the raw materials, they're getting raw materials from each one of these areas, different types of raw materials, like India, they get spices and fabrics and things like that, textiles. Um, for selling goods, once they make their finished product, they get to sell that back to all those colonies for a huge profit. Here's another example, just another picture of the colonization. This adds the 13 colonies in here and some little bit in South America and Central America here. But there is a very famous phrase that went about, and it said that the British Empire was known as the empire on which the sun never set. So if you think about that for a second, no matter where the sun was, no matter where it was in relation to the Earth's rotation, the sun was always shining on the British Empire because they had colonies completely across the globe. And that, I think, speaks volumes to just how awesome that British Empire really was until the 13 colonies kind of change all that. They start a chain reaction, which we'll talk about in the next unit. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in here. Um, Thinking about Queen Victoria, King James, and I'm sorry, Queen Elizabeth the First. The big reason that they needed this empire, or the one of the big benefits, aside from the money and protection, was just getting those resources that they need. And so, all that tea, sugar, and cotton, where do you think you got all that from? Those big resources came from parts of their empire, and then they would turn around and do something with it and sell it back to their colonies and made a huge amount of money, lots and lots of profit from that. And which is kind of a interesting fact because the colonies do start to get tired of of that cycle. Um, Queen Victoria, uh, the triangular trade here. How did it work? Really simple. Great Britain would trade, would go down to West Africa um, and trade for slaves, get things that they need, cross this Atlantic Ocean. This is the Middle Passage we'll talk about here shortly. Get to the Americas, West Indies, get into the colonies, get more resources, and bring back to Great Britain the things they needed, the raw materials, to make those raw materials and sell back to those colonies. So let me give you a little cartoon reenactment, so to speak. How did the triangular trade route really work? First of all, someone would buy a ship. You go to the king and queen, ask for money, ask for financing to buy a ship. They say, okay, we're going to help you. Uh, in terms, you're going to pay us back with a huge interest rate um, because we're financing you. So you buy a ship, and then you are off to America. All right, we're going to go to America and see if we can turn a profit ourselves. Okay, but we're not going to start in America. We're going to go to Africa first. Okay, so what do? We load it with British things that are short in Africa, like guns, gunpowder, beads, copper kettles, pans, nails, cloth, all the things that the Africans need, because we're going to trade with them to get things that we need. Um, Now, you might wonder, one beads. What beads? What money is there in selling beads? Well, you'll see. So we sell to West Africa. How much for those slaves? And what do they say? 100 beads. Well, golly, beads must be really, really valuable. They made of silver or gold, you may ask. No, actually, they're not. They're literally just shells found on the ocean beach. Things like that. So they would find these shells, and that is what the Africans prized most of all. They wanted these beads because they could make headdresses to show their leadership. They made headdresses to show who was the boss, who was the king, and that's all they were selling their Africans for. A little bit about that. African tribes would fight each other, they would capture each other, and then sell them to their English allies. And that's kind of how the slavery started in Africa with the English. Um, so we unload the ship, we swap the goods for things that we are short of in America, such as slaves, right? So far, so good. We've given them all the beads they want. They've given us all the slaves we can handle on our boat, and we pack our boat like crazy. We stack them 4 or 5 deep in the boat to get as many slaves on there as we can because we're going to sell them in America. All right. So the triangular trade route, first thing, it's a good life unless you are a slave, right? So the slaves now have gotten on the boat, we've crossed the ocean, we've landed in America, they're unloaded, and they are put uh, in slave auctions, uh, and they are sold to the highest bidder. Pretty nasty practice, but it was very, very profitable for those in the South, in the colonies especially. So let's talk about slavery in the 13 colonies. Okay, so you have, or you'll get your note page for school, the notes, and these are the questions that you'll have to know for the test, the information you need to know. So let's compare slavery in the North and the South. Well, in the North, the ways that they were like, the number of slaves increased in both areas. Okay, people wanted slaves. It was not just the southern colonies who had them. The northern colonies also had lots and lots of slaves. The numbers really increased from 1730 to 1760. That's when we see a boom because that's when tobacco takes off and you need a lot of slaves to harvest a lot of tobacco. We'll see another boom a little bit later once cotton is introduced. There were many more enslaved people in the South, but there were lots in the North. And slavery grew much faster in the South because that's where the plantations, that's where the really big farms were. So everybody needed slaves in the South to keep producing those products, those cotton and tobacco crops. The more slaves you had, the more product you could make, the more money you could make, the more slaves you could buy. Extremely vicious cycle. There was some resistance to the slavery. Enslaved Africans found ways to resist. On the plantation, sometimes they would set fire to the property. They broke tools or they even stole food. And sometimes they would even destroy the crops. And then, of course, you all know that some slaves would escape. They jumped on that imaginary or metaphoric thing called the Underground Railroad and escaped to great places like St. Augustine that we talked about, where a black person could become free just for becoming a Catholic and joining the military. And then sometimes they would have uprisings. The main uprising that you need to be aware of is the Stone Rebellion in 1739, which happened in South Carolina. Interesting little rebellion. Um, they were going to fight back. They all got together, but in the end, when it was all said and done, a lot of the slaves decided not to fight back, and they went and told their slave owners that there was going to be a rebellion. And the slave owners went and found those who were responsible for it, and of course executed them, which is really awful. But we'll read about that a little bit later. But that is how slavery worked in the South. Okay. Um, the slaves were really good about sharing their information between slave communities very secretly, and that became part of American culture. They wouldn't pass the word, "Hey, we're going to try to escape today." They would put it in a song, in a very secretive song, a hymn that only they would understand what it meant. They built musical instruments to play those songs. And they use these songs to send those secret messages among themselves. And one of the real popular ones was called Follow the Drinking Gourd. And in class, I'll play this song for you. It was a really popular song, and there were hundreds of songs like this that carried those secret messages that only the slaves really knew what they meant. So let's talk about those three colonies, the three regions and slavery. So, what did each of the three continents have to offer the other, and what were the needs of the three continents that made the triangular trade route so successful? How did this influence the Middle Passage? Well, if you think about it, slavery really lends itself to harvesting the crops or gathering the raw materials that England needed. So the more slaves you had, the more materials you could collect, the more material you could sell to the English uh, monarchy, the more money you can make. And like I said, that became a very vicious cycle. So let's look at that triangular trade route one more time. So England wants. What are the things that England? Let's start with what England has. Okay, uh, or England wants. They want sugar cane. They want silk. They want raw cotton. They want rum. They want tobacco. They want all those raw materials. What are they going to do with those raw materials? They're going to turn them into manufactured goods. All right. Things that the England has, well, they've got cigars. Because of that tobacco, they make cigars. Because of that cotton, they make cloth. Um, they also get other raw materials like iron, which they make weapons from iron and steel. They're going to take those things because Africa wants them. Africa wants those cigars, those cigarettes, the cloth, the clothing, the guns, and the weapons, the iron, the steel. All those things Africans want. And so England will trade with them. What are some things that Africa has that they would trade with? Well, gold, ivory, spice, wood. But the big one is slaves. That is a very big product, and lots of English want all those slaves, right? So, what does the North American and the West Indies want? Well, they want slaves, obviously, right? They have to have slaves because the more slaves they get, the more money they can essentially make. Okay, and because they have all those slaves, what are the things that the North America and the West Indies have? Well, they've got the sugarcane, silk, raw cotton, rum, tobacco plant, whale oil, indigo plant, raw materials like iron, metal, things like that. And so this is a cycle that just continues. It goes over and over and over and over and over. And you just keep replenishing those slaves to make all these products that England takes and makes the manufactured goods, and they just keep selling, and everybody is making a lot of money based on slave labor. Okay? And that is the triangular trade route um, for the most part. Okay? And one last little thing that we have slave trade in the West, we get the Middle Passage, and we get the arrival in America. That's how that works, okay? So let's talk a little bit about this last piece right here, the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was probably the most brutal trip that the Africans would have to make. The Middle Passage here in Ghana, where most of the slaves were taken from, West Ghana, West Africa, they were put on boats and they would go to the New World. So the slave trade in West Africa, they'd cross the Atlantic Ocean and they would arrive in the New World. This Middle Passage was horrendous. It was awful. They were on a boat for months at a time. The slaves would literally be laid down and stacked up like lumber or bags of flour or whatever. And they would cross that ocean. They had to use the restroom on each other. They didn't get much food to eat. It was awful. And many slaves would die on that passage, which was another reason they got as many as they could, because they would lose some. And sometimes, if they ran out of food and they couldn't feed them, they would discard them. And how do you discard them? They would throw them overboard. They would get sick. They would vomit all over the place. It was a horrendous passage for those African Americans. And it becomes known as the Middle Passage, something that is feared by African slaves who are put on there. Okay, so that is Triangular Trade Route, Slavery in the Colonies, and the Middle Passage. When you get back to class, make sure you get your notes. We'll put them in. And I will see you for the next unit, guys. Have a great day.